Today I'm going to talk about the reception of Spinoza in about early 1940s among the young Hegelians, and as my topic is about the radicalization of action and the social transformation of Spinoza and the Hess-Marx Triangle. So, Spinoza, through the Pantheism controversy generated by Jacobi and Lessing, on the one hand, is an important source of German idealism, as Hegel we discussed before, and on the other hand, Spinoza serves as an intellectual hero of young Hegelians throughout the first half of the 19th century to overcome the contemplative side of Hegel's philosophy. The reception of Spinoza in the philosophy of Moses Hess and Karl Marx is particularly remarkable here. When Karl Marx prepared for his dissertation in Berlin in early 1841, he left several notebooks, including the excerpt of theological political treatise, which is often regarded as a political intervention which aims at liberating the multitude from superstition. And at the same time, Marx studied Book 3 of Aristotle's On the Soul, which expresses Marx's primary and persistent interest of different human faculties in the natural history, such as five senses, imagination, common senses, thinking, and so on, which are related to a theory of action. And in addition, Epicureanism attracts him, which not only denies revelation and providence, but also, maybe more importantly, is an endorsement of practical wisdom's priority to theoretical wisdom. In April of 1841, Marx traveled to Bonn in search of a teaching position, and it was there that he met Moses Hess for the first time. Subsequently, Hess wrote to his friend Auerbach, who is a German novelist on Spinoza. I have a picture of his book here. And later, Hess published The Philosophy of Action and On the Nature of Money, which transformed the theory and the practice relationship into a radical philosophy of action inspired by Spinoza's ethics and also Tchaikovsky. I got here. And Hess considers the Spinozan concept of freedom as the immanent doctrine for communism. A being can live and act according to his nature and express his essence unhindered. So we could assume that it is through Hess and that Spinoza truly enters Marx's horizon, especially during the period of Leibniz Zeitung durch französische Jahrbücher. Yet rather than a linear succession of intellectual history, Spinoza, Hess, Marx, as my title shows, forms a theoretical triangle. Marx both inherits the radicalized discourse of action, and through his reconstruction of Spinoza, goes beyond Hess with a new concept of praxis. Okay, and next I will show some Hess reception of Spinoza in his context. His philosophy starts with an rather organic Hegelian philosophy of history. In his first book, The Holy History of Mankind, he divided the history into three stages: past, present, and future, namely from the primary communism represented by Moses to the Christian ecoism, and finally the last stage represented by Spinoza, in which the dualism between mind and body, religion and politics are overcame. He uses the term what TTP calls the true religion, we could say here, and in this last stage, our love of God is perfectly aligned with our positive understanding of communal living, which to some extent means a resurrection of the Hebrew commonwealth. With the reunification of the multitude's mind and body, a stage of action is coming. As he said, the word of the master into a deed.
Yifan, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Your PowerPoint, it may have got stuck on the first page.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it change now?
No, it doesn't. No.
Yes, now it has. You may need to just or perhaps check it with the audience in case it gets stuck again.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there.
So it works now, right?
Yeah, you're on the second slide.
But does it move to the third? I don't know why it's
now.
not.
Yes, now it did. Yeah.
Okay, maybe this way. And the philosophy of action and on the nature of money are further attempts to clarify the ontological basis for socialism, unlike Hegel's dogmatic critique of Spinoza's ontology, where we can find no place for subjectivity. Hess boldly to his time grasps the core of Spinoza's ethics as the empowerment of individuals. It's very interesting here that some of his thinking contains some post-metaphysical characters, even in a very naive way. For example, he believes that becoming rather than being, realizing rather than realization, for him, individual is herself a kind of self-creating activity. So the next page, on the other hand, on the nature of money, highly influenced by Feuerbach, his combined philosophy with political economy and introduces the social dimension in which action always happens in relation to others and in specific social contexts. In Spinoza's context, the more we can act from our nature, striving to be the adequate causes of a series of effects, the more we are close to freedom. A free community based on love and interaction, which could always be recognized and pursued by our reason, are more likely to increase our power of act. So he's nearly used the same expression here. Love, wherever it also appears, is more powerful than egoism. Then, when these plural power relations are brought into sphere of political economy, he's called them intercourse, or a well-known Marxist term, productive power. So, and in terms of the mind and body parallelism, it's worth noting here. It's worth noting here that his active was noting here that Spinoza emphasized willing and the knowing are actually one and the same power of mind. The mind constantly tends to affirm body's desire. The unification of willing and the knowing is a primary expression of philosophy of action. He often conceives himself as an apostle, as he called himself in his first book, an apostle of Spinoza. In the correspondence with the Russian socialist Alexander Herzen, as I cited here, Hayes explains, I don't just know what I want, but also want what I know. I'm more of an apostle rather than a philosopher. An apostle is different from a philosopher who transforms theoretical knowledge into practice and makes theory serve his own critical purpose. We could recognize that Hayes, in the name of Spinoza, plays an important role in the birth of a Marxist practical turn, as Marx cited and praises his book in the Paris manuscript here. So it's interesting here that his active political beings could not be expressed by pantheism reading of Spinoza, because for his pantheism is a mere negation of difference and equal divinity in the abstract, in the attribute of matter, and therefore only a frozen and a homogeneous relationship of equality without the positive understanding of freedom. His requires a revolution in the form of anarchism, the dynamic social life which never consolidates into potestas and cannot be absorbed by mere abstract reflection, which sounds rather familiar to today's radical philosophy. The dual origin and also paragons of the modern revolutionary action are hence dated back to Fichte in Germany and Babeuf in France. So it's here that Hayes permits or even praises the violence and the terrorism of revolution. It's rather problematic here. And so next I will give some reflections and a critique on this return to Spinoza. It could be highly controversial and even risky. He violates Spinoza's teaching in the following three aspects, which will give us inspirations for understanding give us inspirations for understanding Marxist for understanding why Marx could share the same problematic with Spinoza. I want to know where does Marx start and where Marx and Hess diverge. Hess and also Feuerbach fall into an anthropological illusion in their use of species being, namely that humans are at the center of nature and that God is merely the mirror of humans. This is an imagination that Spinoza severely rejects. Therefore, we could say that Hess and Feuerbach is only on the level of a kind of inter-individuality, but not trans-individuality, which unites Spinoza and Marx again by Balibar, which we when we reread Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. And secondly, it's the problem of immanence. By resorting to a radical break in the history, Hess violates the Spinozan teaching of immanence and step into a certain philosophical future. This is also a problem about critique. As I cited here, Hess said, as soon as men united, and this is a kind of direct intercourse, then it will take place the inhuman and external means of intercourse. And then by replacing the real and by replacing the universal abstractions with real and concrete life, then a utopia future can be realized in the present. While Marx never attempts to replace the abstraction, but turns into the civil society represented by Judaism, and later he turns to a scientific study of the genesis of society. So accordingly, in the ethical and the normative area, Hess emphasized on the transcendence over natural history and therefore denies the transformation between passions and actions. Love then becomes the highest and fixed resource of normativity. He therefore transforms the Spinoza's ethics into a pure form of moralism, namely that moral elevation and cultivation as the way out of capitalism. And the last point is, as the result of absolute action and the radical break of totality, Hess constructs his political philosophy on anarchism, which means he simply ignores the Spinoza's prudence on the tension between ethics about freedom and the realistic perspective of political treatise. Nevertheless, Spinoza never turns to the radical position of social autonomy against state, but rather insists on the virtue of state as peace and security. This project of radical democracy becomes the very start point of early Marx, and brings the relationship between state and society into a far more complex context, which also foreshadows the later separation of Marxism from anarchism. And finally, I got a citation from the mature Marx. Well, it's very interesting here that he says, what is the true inner structure of Spinoza? It still remains unclear today, but still it proves that Marx never forgets his study on Spinoza in his early life. And what does this legacy of radical democracy means to him will be a further project in the future. So thank you for the attention.